First Friday for November. Happy autumn. I hope everyone is feeling cozy and wearing lots of sweaters and drinking lots of tea. I'm just going to wait for Lyndsey to join, and hopefully we don't have any technical difficulties today, but we always start a couple minutes early just in case. We are talking about sex positivity today. We're super excited about the topic. So we'll see if Lyndsey is joining. Got my tea here. I'm feeling cozy. Okay, let's try and let Lyndsey in. I don't think it's working.
It's flipped around. How nice of it. It kicked me out initially, and then I was like, oh no, not today, please.
It
Nice.
worked.
It worked. Yay.
Hey, Lyndsey, happy November.
You as well, Sam. It's great to see you.
While I was waiting for you, I was hoping everyone's drinking tea and wearing sweaters.
I should have tea. I just have water.
Unless we have any Southern Hemisphere people, and then they can be getting increasingly warm.
Yeah, they could be like, this is too much for me, actually. I don't need tea.
Well, we are talking about sex positivity today. We'll start with just our standard introduction in case you're new here. And Lyndsey, you'll tell us a little bit about the topic and why we're doing it, and then we'll dive in. Lyndsey, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Lyndsey Fraser. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist and IA accredited professional. I have a private practice in South Minneapolis where I specialize in relationships and sexuality utilizing the Enneagram. So that's a little bit about me. Tell us about you, Sam.
I fogged up my glasses because my tea was too hot, so you know I'm doing it right. I am Dr. Sam E Greenberg. I'm a sexuality researcher and an Enneagram coach specializing in intimacy, sexuality, and relationships. And my research specifically focused on sexual desire and how it overlaps with Enneagram type and instinct. Lyndsey, do you want to tell the people about our series that we're doing and our topic for today?
Yes, so we are on the third episode of our Sexuality Basic series. So if you missed those other two episodes, go back to either our YouTube page or here on Instagram, and you can go back and watch those two other episodes. We did the 4D model. What did we do episode 1 on?
What is sexual desire? And then what is the 4D model?
Yep. And then we're going to be following that up with 2 other series of 3. And the next one we're going to do is actually on relationship basics. We'll be starting that one off on the relationship cycle and kind of what that looks like. And then we'll follow up with 2 more episodes on relationships. And then we're going to follow up into Enneagram basics as well. Mostly of what we talk about here is Enneagram and sexuality, but not everybody that follows or watches or is interested in us even knows necessarily what the Enneagram is. And so we thought it'd be great to go back to sort of those basics. And the reason we're doing these different episodes too, as well, is that Sam and I are kind of experts on multiple different areas. And oftentimes what you just see from us is Enneagram and sexuality. And I think you're missing some really beautiful things and areas of knowledge that we have and experience. And we want to share more of those pieces of who we are with you as well. And so you might see that as we go forward, some of our episodes might not even have anything to do with Enneagram, but you know you can always ask those questions. But everything here will be relationship, sexuality, and Enneagram related.
We got a nice comment. Nice work, ladies. We appreciate it. So why we're talking about sex positivity today as part of our Sexuality Basics series is that sex positivity is one of the most popular modern theoretical understandings of sexuality that people hold in the West. I'll talk about the history of it and how it became popular, but it is one of the central ways of viewing sexuality that we see today, especially with younger people. And there's some research to indicate that there is a link between sex positivity, sex positive attitudes, and overall better sexuality outcomes, both health and overall satisfaction. So DM me for references if you want references on that. Oh, Misty's here. Hi, Misty. We love you. Um, so it's an important thing to understand. And I don't know if everyone, a lot of us have heard the term, probably most of us have heard the term, but I don't know if everyone understands the kind of the nuance of it, what it actually is. So I'll talk briefly about the definition, and then Lyndsey will talk about how common sex positivity is with her clients. So sex positivity, there's many definitions overall, but it's really this idea that any consensual sex or solo sex or sexual expression that's happening without shame and with freedom is healthy, is good, is a positive expression of the sexual self. So that covers a whole spectrum, radical acceptance of all sexual identities and preferences, including every part of the asexual spectrum, with no moral judgment. So a lot of people might hear sex positivity and think it doesn't include the asexual spectrum, but in fact it does. It's the idea that every outlook and attitude towards sex is good and healthy and right, including a lack of interest in sex. The other two things I'll say on definitions is we have Carol Queen, who was a 1990s feminist who did a lot of work around sex positivity. Her definition specifically was that it's a radical affirmation that we each grow in our own passions. Um, it respects our unique sexual profiles, even as we acknowledge some of us have been damaged by our culture. That our culture tries to eradicate sexual difference. We embrace those, and we know that she says, we grow like weeds. So that means that sex positivity also includes the whole idea that we grow and change in our sexual preferences and expressions over our lifetime. And then the last thing I'll say is more recently, Dr. Emily Nagoski's definition of sex positivity is the radical, all-inclusive belief that each person's body belongs to that person. The idea being that you have body sovereignty, and you can express that with that body sovereignty sexually, however feels good to you, as long as you're not violating like the rights or consent of other people. So, Lyndsey, firstly, do you have anything to add on definition? And then I'd love to hear like how common is a sex positive outlook in your clients in your experience?
No, not with the definition part. This is exactly how I define it in my practice as well with clients. I know you asked me right before we met, and I was like, actually, that's how I define it too. It's not much for me to add into what you have already included there. What's interesting in my office, so I think I'm going into my 14th year of practice now, and the interesting thing is that, when people come into my office around sexuality, I have been in practice these last 14 years. I've only had 3 people come in with healthy, positive sexual messaging. Oftentimes, actually, what you see is the majority of people either have shame messages around sexuality or they were taught not to talk about it. Now, I'm also in the Midwest. I'm in Minneapolis, though I do work with coaching clients sometimes that are not in this area as well. And I do see this, especially in the Midwest, but in the US in general. And so I do want to note too that, this is more probably, will see a little bit more sexual positivity, especially when you go to places like Denmark or kind of in Europe and those things where we know there's a little bit more sexual positivity kind of happening in some of these more Scandinavian countries and things like that, and European countries. And you might see things a little bit different, say like if you are from the West Coast or the East Coast, like bigger cities like San Francisco or LA or New York City, where there's a little bit more openness to sexual positivity happening. But overall, most of us kind of come in and don't have the language or know how to talk about sexuality, or are given preconceived notions about what's okay or not okay to engage in sexually. One of the interesting things that I will kind of see as well is you are going to see a little bit of difference based on the people that come into my office based on age. So one of the things that I do see oftentimes when I'm getting people that are like, I get some college students, or I get some middle 20s, or, one thing is they're much more comfortable with gender fluidity. That's something that's just normal to them. They're able to identify, like, I'm pansexual, I'm bisexual. They just kind of have that language, and they're much more identified with kind of who they are sexually and like what they need and want sexually. And so it's a little bit more sex positivity that I see sort of in our 20 somethings. When we get like our 30s and 40 somethings, there might be a little bit more like if they're into more of relationship dynamics, like open relationship dynamics, like, again, you're going to see a lot more. I'm just going to say who I am and what I am, and if I'm in my 20s, but your 30s and 40s, they're still interested in it. Even people in your 50s and 60s are as well. They're a little bit more interested in it. They're more accepting of it, but they'll hide it more. So it might be, I am, someone that's doing ethical non-monogamy, or I am someone that maybe is part of a roping community. But I do find that people that are in their 30s and 40s like feel very connected to that and belonging in that, but they may keep it more hidden from people that are in their lives. And then you see a little bit more hesitation to engage, or even talk about those things when you get the, 55 plus community. That being said, they're still interested. They just got a lot different messaging around sexuality and sexual education. Some of them didn't even, depending on where they went to school, may not have got anything on that piece of it. And then you kind of see, and one of the things we know about sexuality is it kind of opens and closes. And so like in the 90s, in that 2000 period, we had a little bit more of an opening and those kinds of things, a little bit more shutting down kind of in the 80s. And, kind of come and gone, 20s kind of starting that off, right? The 1920s kind of starting that off, a little bit more freedom around sexuality and stuff. We don't actually even think about that generation, but they did actually have a little bit more opening up. And we could go a whole thing into that as well, the history around sexuality. We may be moving more into a period of closing. I'm hoping not, just kind of based on some of the things that are happening in the United States. But I am seeing a little bit more of that trying to kind of contain and maybe not, hopefully it will not take traction and it will not happen. But there's a little bit more of that judgment around how people sexually show up, gender identity, whether you're gay or straight, some of these sorts of things that I don't feel like 10, 15 years ago were even like, it was just common, like we're all different, it's all okay. So some of those types of things I think are kind of interesting now, where I'm seeing a little bit more judgment, or maybe more permission to be judgmental. Not that more people are, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it is interesting with the generations. And I do feel like our 20 somethings really have a lot more freedom and sexual expression than some of us that are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s beyond. Even though, like, I know with my group, I'm in my 40s, we were able to kind of some of that, like, it's women can have sexual relationships. It's okay to be a sexual being, and kind of all of these sorts of things. And you don't have to be in monogamy and those kinds of things and decide what you want, but still not quite in the same ways that I would say that it is for our 20 somethings right now, who interestingly enough are actually having less sex. So
We should maybe do like a youth sexuality episode at some point. We can interview some people in their 20s for it. I just thought of that idea.
Ooh, we should do every group.
Yes. Okay. Let's put that on our list for the future. So I was going to talk briefly about the history of sex positivity, but you actually just alluded to all of it when you're talking about the opening and the closing starting in the 1920s. I would say, well, actually, as I was doing research for this episode, I found this quote that calls for tolerance of sexual activity outside of the established norms of Western world have been present since antiquity. So I guess technically it's since antiquity. But, the 20th century antecedents of sex positivity really did start in the 1920s with Wilhelm Reich, psychoanalyst and basically sexuality, sort of uncredited sexuality theorist, influential sexuality theorist. He actually did coin the term sex positivity, sexual positivity. But it's often attributed more to like the 1990s feminists. movement. So it started sort of in the 1920s as an idea. And then, as Lyndsey said, there was kind of like a blossoming and then a closing back and a blossoming and a closing back, all the way up until the 1960s. We had the free love movement, which is like one of those openings. Up through the 1970s, we have the second wave feminism happening in the 1970s, which is a big time of empowerment for women and femmes around sexuality. And what I want to talk about here, and that I think is interesting when we get to the perspectives, different perspectives on sex positivity, is what's called the feminist sex wars, which is two really different perspectives on sex positivity that emerge around the 1970s and 1980s. I know this is starting to sound like a college course on sexuality. I'm so sorry. I'm a 5. I would love to teach a college course on sexuality. I will be done soon on this part. But briefly, the feminist sex wars is this idea within feminist theory. A divide exists between pro-sex feminists, which would be more of our traditional sex positive perspective. All sexual desire and consensual sexual expression is healthy, it's empowering, it's good, versus our radical feminists who view certain expressions of desire as problematic and certain types of sexual behaviors as problematic insofar as they're influenced by patriarchal ideals in the culture. So that was a big debate, and that'll come up too when we talk about our perspectives on sex positivity. But into the 90s is when the term sex positive emerged sort of officially. And it was sort of the foremothers of sex positivity. There are a bunch of feminist theorists like Carol Queen and Ellen Willis who made sex positivity an essential movement within third wave feminism, which started in the 1990s and came through today. It really became I'd say the most popular perspective on sexuality in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And it remains popular today, but as Lyndsey said, I don't know if we're seeing a swing now back to kind of like one of those closings again, where it would become less popular. Overall, I think it's popular enough that I want to discuss it. So I think it's quite influential in how people see sexuality, whether they sort of like ascribe to it or not. And then final thing I want to mention before we just chat, Lyndsey, probably for the rest about this, is kink positivity, which is an adjacent concept, very similar, embraces the same principles as sex positivity as applied to kink and BDSM and fetishes. So sex positivity at large already includes those things in terms of what it embraces. But kink positivity has emerged as its own term, meaning that these interests, which were historically seen as sexually deviant, and members of these communities as deviant, have responded to those judgments by taking a radically accepting stance on themselves and others in their community. It embraces, as sex positivity does, a focus on consent, communication, sexual expression without shame. So I want to mention that as well before we get to our perspectives and nuance and complicating this whole discussion. Lyndsey, what is on your mind in terms of different perspectives on sex positivity?
I think one of the things that, we were talking a little bit ahead of time is just like when we talk sex positivity, you almost have to bring in some of the sex addiction and sexual compulsivity definitions for that. There's a really huge kind of battle, I would say, versus like sexual addiction and sexual compulsivity. I will say my bias is more towards sexual compulsivity versus sexual addiction. And the reasons for that is sometimes sexual addiction models are going to take what I consider to be healthy, normal sexual behaviors and classify them into being problematic or addictive sexual behaviors, especially if we're taking a sexual positivity stance where any kind of kink or fetish that you might be into or your sexual expression is healthy and normal as long as it doesn't violate others, which I know Sam and I have talked about many times here. Sometimes some of the sex addiction models will put some of those behaviors into being sexual addiction. And the reality is like, it kind of depends. Any sexual behavior that we do can be an addiction or a compulsivity issue or concern, or it cannot, or it can be faulty expression of, trauma or other things that may be happening or occurring. This is a much more complex issue. I think we could go a lot more into this, but I think it's important to understand too that like really what we're looking for when we say sexual positivity is like recognizing what your healthy sexuality is as well. And that really you have to have your own definition of that we can't be taking the definition from, like say a sex addiction model that's saying like this, this particular, I'm trying to think of like one in particular, but I do know that they will put some of the, what I call kinks and fetishes sort of as sexual addiction behavior. It's like, well, I might be into bondage and that might just be a healthy expression of my sexuality, or I might be into bondage and BDSM because I'm playing out some sort of trauma, or I might be into it as a way to move through my trauma. All three of those things can exist, and you really have to know sort of the difference in any of those. When you're looking at, it's like one of the people I will often recommend to look at if you're wanting to know more about sexual compulsivity, he writes this wonderful book that's called Ethical Porn for Dicks. His name is Dr. David Ley, Ley, but he is really one of the experts in this particular field that if you want more information, and I think does take a sexual positivity stance towards compulsivity issues and pornography use and things like that as well. So check him out. I can make sure that I link his information to him. And I just like the guy. I don't even know the guy. So I'm not like promoting for him.
I want to say briefly kind of like what the proponents of sex positivity would say and then what the critics would say before I would say kind of like my own position or our positions more. So what the proponents of sex positivity say is that sex positivity is necessary to counter the deeply embedded shame messaging that most of us have been enculturated with around sexuality, and we have received those over our life, which has resulted in a deep amount of suffering in most people, especially people with sexual interests that are sort of like outside the norm or outside what they think the norm is. A lot of suffering, self-judgment, and sex positivity is kind of like the antidote to that, which is this idea that like I'm a perfect, beautiful, whole sexual being, whether I'm asexual or on that spectrum or not, and anything that I'm into is okay and normal, with the exceptions of things that hurt people or that are harmful. Harmful directly meaning like violating someone's consent. So outside of things that violate someone's consent, the idea is that all of your sexual interests and sexual behaviors are like healthy and good and normal. That the arguments for this is we need that to get counter to the shame. And I would argue that for many, many, many people, this has to be the goal because they're so deeply embedded in shame that they really need to go all the way to like embracing their full self before they could go any further, before they could even think about defining what's healthy and unhealthy for them personally. They have to let go of the shame first. So sex positivity is like really important for that. What the critics of sex positivity say is that we're all enculturated beings living in a society, and some of these sexual expressions that people are doing are actually damaging to them and their lives and their partners, even if it feels pleasurable in the moment. And that should be attended to, and that we're acting out the culture in the bedroom, and we should be kind of critical of the ways that's happening. So, and finally, that a sex positive framework might leave no room for the idea that we sometimes do sexualize our pathologies. Like we know that to be true as, mental health professionals. That was a lot to say, but I guess to kind of wrap it up a little bit, my take would be more, it's more nuanced and complex, that one sexuality must be completely radically accepted, yes, before we could ever move towards a mature, grounded acceptance of ourselves free from shame that also does interrogate whether our personal sexual expression is healthy for us personally and for our partners personally, and the ways culture might have influenced it. Lyndsey, you and I were talking before this about how the same, like two different people could do the same exact sexual behavior. And for one, it is absolutely liberating and healthy and is on their way to, growth. And for the other person, it could be compulsive and addictive and a big negative force in their life. And it's identical from the outside looking in. So I'm going to pause there. Like, what does that bring up for you, Lyndsey?
Well, I think I completely agree. Like I was saying, like even something like roping or bondage, right? It can be all three of those things. It can be something that's healthy, liberating, ability to move through something. It could be something that's addictive. I mean, the other thing to add on to that too is sometimes we do play out things in the sexual realm that are trauma related, right? It's almost like when you think of kids in play therapy who play through, like we as adults can do that sometimes in the sexual play that we're doing, and knowing the difference. But even in that sense, right, when I'm bringing that up, there can be two things happening. One is I've had a trauma, and this is playing out a trauma for me, but through the play of sexuality, I'm able to move through and heal. And then for other people, you could be stuck in a loop of replaying the trauma by doing this. This is why the sexuality piece is so complicated, and we can't just say X behavior is a problematic sexual behavior, because many of these behaviors can look very different or very similar. And for, like you said, Sam, for one person, not a problem at all. It's liberating. It's embracing who they are sexually, having more identity, becoming more whole, more self-actualized. And then for another person, it could be unhealthy. And for another person, it can be a play out of compulsive sexual behavior that's taking away from other aspects of their lives, whether it be connection with a partner, or whether it be like, I'd rather engage in the sexual behavior than go out and hang out with my friends, or, hurting my body. I've had people with even some sexual compulsivity issues where it's like the behavior they're doing, it's not an issue, is they're doing it so much that they're actually hurting their physical body, to the point that I had one person up in the hospital because of some of the things that they were doing, right? And so it's so much more complex, and you have to kind of take the person in your office. And I also think really understanding that there's a lot of different, that positivity to me, or like that openness, even as the therapist or the coach, the person working with this, is that when you sit in here, it's like, it's not about the behavior, it's about the person sitting in front of you. And you have to be able to navigate and ask the questions to know whether this is something that's liberating, problematic, or unhealthy.
So I'm curious for you, Lyndsey, because I know you do work with your clients on defining the circles of, healthy, neutral, and unhealthy sexual expression for your clients. Like, how do you kind of walk people through this? I'm especially curious if someone's coming in with like a lot of shame around something, walk them through figuring out what's healthy and unhealthy for them, but also knowing that the shame itself is unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, there's a lot of different things I do within the sexuality. I always do sexual histories with clients, and like I actually use a hybrid. I use Barry McCarthy's model for sexual histories. I'd add in a bunch of my own questions so that I ask people. Because I think first off, sometimes just walking people through that sexual history story, and the ability for the therapist to hear it and to hold it and for it to like have existence, can sometimes actually be one of the first steps to undoing the shame. So I always will start with people there before we even move into anything else. I actually will only take on one or two people that have sexual compulsivity issues, for instance. And so more often than not, I'm going to be doing the model you're talking about is like, I'll have like in the middle, the problematic or compulsive behavior, actually draw circles. Then you have like your borderline behaviors, and you have your healthier kind of behaviors on the outside. Or do I do the opposite way? I've done it both ways now that I'm like thinking about it. But I just help people identify, like, tell me about the behaviors that lead you into, the behaviors that become compulsive or that are unhealthy for you. And what we're really doing is trying to kind of help them create more of a circle, like, here are the healthier sexual behaviors that I have. How do I keep putting more things into that? I mean, also within that too, oftentimes, like, we only think about the sexual acts and behaviors that we do as sexuality, and really there's a lot of other things that we do. So like, am I paying attention to how sexual energy is turned off or turned on in my body, right? Like, by even just like paying attention to the five senses. And so helping people become more aware of like what's happening with that, and then also like, does shame get triggered when I'm turned on by something? And then helping them kind of process, those pieces and those components. And I think oftentimes too, we have to figure out, like, I use the definition of what's the difference between shame and guilt. So like, when we look at shame and guilt, right, it's like really we're trying to move people from shame to guilt. And shame is like, because I've done this behavior or action, I'm intrinsically bad, not worthy, not lovable, whatever else it might be. If I'm guilty, it's like, I did this behavior and action, it's not very helpful for me. It doesn't actually say anything about who I am. More often than not, people that have maybe like what I consider like out of the Actually, I get it both ways. Sometimes people are too vanilla, think there's something wrong with them too. So it doesn't really matter. But like that, like there isn't shame, like your sexual expression, like moving them through, like how do we recognize when the shame is being triggered, when that is present there for you? How do we, pay attention, like when, I mean, it's just complex. I feel like I could go on forever, Sam, as I'm talking. Like, oh, I'm getting close to the end. I got to wrap it up here. But I think it's just helping people identify when the shame is present and also identifying like what is pleasurable and enjoyable for me.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And I think that highlights the fact that it's really individual to the person and their whole history, their personal culture, their personal community, and you'll be able to work with all of that when you're working with individuals. Kind of the last thing I want to say is one of the reasons, like we really wanted to talk about this is because both of the camps in those kind of sex wars that I talked about, it tends to be black and white, too black and white, and not nuanced enough. Where the sex positivity and kink positivity camp is like, and I see this especially with my kink positivity people, they're like, anyone who's critical of kink, anyone who is critical of any sex thing is anti-kink, anti-sex, like they are wrong. Every single thing we're doing is right, good, healthy. Too black and white, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
the radical perspective is like all porn, all sex work is like anti-empowering, and those things shouldn't be happening because those are bad for women and femmes, and like that's completely false too, right? So I think we just want to complicate the discussion like we always do with everything, and just talk about how much nuance there is, since this is like one of the predominant theory models out there on sexuality. And like Lyndsey said at the beginning, we like to talk about just pure sexuality topics sometimes. So folks know we don't always talk about Enneagram and sex, even though that is like our primary thing that we talk about. Um, don't want to forget, lastly, to sign up for our self-paced course, which is the Enneagram and Sexuality for Transformed Relationships. Lyndsey, do you want to say like a word about that?
Yeah, I think that it was launched in September, right? So we launched it, and we've gotten really good feedback. Like I've been really excited about that. People fill out surveys when they're done, and one of the feedback we got is like, "What didn't I learn?" And I'm talking to all my colleagues about it. We have put a lot of energy, capacity. Even like Sam said, like like we've been on a rest because we put so much effort into this. But it's such a beautiful course. So if you are a therapist or if you are an individual who wants to understand your sexuality more in relation to the Enneagram, we do put some basics around the Enneagram in the beginning. So you don't have to be an Enneagram expert to kind of get a good experience out of that. And we have a track for therapists and for individuals. And it's 5.5 CEUs and two cultural and one ethical. And for you of those of you that are in Minnesota, like it is reporting year. So if you are behind on those CEUs, this is a great opportunity to get some more and to also, check off those ethical and cultural CEUs that we need to get. But we have had wonderful feedback from a lot of people are therapists here in Minnesota, and we've had wonderful feedback. They've really been using it and implementing it as well.
It's a full day course, so 6 hours of content, and you can find the link in my bio. Also on both of our websites, enneagramsexpert.com and lyndseyfraser.com.
Yep.
Yes, that's it. So we will see everyone in December for our relationships basics series.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you, Misty, for joining us today too.
Bye, Lyndsey. See you next month.
Bye. See you next month.